So hello, everyone. Welcome to the final Making Public History seminar for 2023. I'm Margaret Anderson from the Old Treasury Building, and I'm your host for this evening. I'd like to begin by acknowledging that I'm speaking to you from the unceded land of the Wurundjeri Woiwurrung people of the Kulin Nation. I thank them for their care of country and of culture and pay my respects to their elders past, present, and emerging. And I'd like to extend that respect to any other elders who may be present tonight. Making Public Histories is a seminar series offered jointly by the Monash University History Program, the History Council of Victoria, and the Old Treasury Building. Each event aims to explore issues and approaches in making public histories. The seminars are open to anyone interested in the creation and impact of history in contemporary society, and I'm delighted that you've joined us this evening. Now, just a brief introduction to the format for the evening. This is a webinar, so unlike a Zoom meeting, only the presenters and hosts will be seen and heard. Each speaker tonight has about 20 minutes, although tonight they will alternate between them. This will be followed by a Q&A session hosted by Alicia Cerrito of the History Council of Victoria. If you have questions for the presenters, and we do hope you will, please use the Q&A button at the bottom of your screen. If you have any technical issues, please use the chat button and we'll endeavour to help you. Of course, please keep your questions polite and respectful. And finally, we are recording this webinar tonight, and the recording will be available in a few days' time. If for any reason a presenter's internet connection is slow or disrupted, they will continue with voice only. Now, the topic for this evening's seminar was actually suggested last year by you, our audience, and it is entitled Behind the Scenes, Making History Exhibitions. As some of you may know, museums are one of the main ways in which the wider public encounters history. Along with film and television, history in museums reaches many thousands of people every year. And so the kind of history presented in museums matters. In this seminar, we explore how museum curators make decisions about the stories and the collections they present. And we have two eminent historical curators to discuss the topic with us. Tracy Taylor is an exhibition producer at Museums Victoria. She's recently returned from the UK, where she worked on major projects at a range of institutions, including the Museum of London, the National Museums of Northern Ireland, and Battersea Power Station. Deborah Tart-Smith is a senior curator, home and community in the History and Technology Department, also at Museums Victoria. She worked previously at the Western Australian Museum and at several museums in Canada. A recent major exhibition some of you may have seen was Love and Sorrow in 2014, and she also co-curated the Melbourne Story in 2008. So between them, they have a wealth of experience to share with us tonight. Tracy will begin, so welcome, Tracy.
Thank you, Margie, and thank you very much to Monash, to the History Council of Victoria, and to the Old Treasury Building for hosting us tonight. Deb and I are both very delighted to be here, and thank you very much to everyone who's attending as well. It's great to have you all here tonight. We'll just get our slides set up and then we will start our presentation. Great. Let's make a start. So as Margie kindly said in her introduction, our exhibition, our talk tonight is about making history exhibitions. And Deb and I have decided that we should take you behind the scenes and talk a little bit about how we put a history exhibition together. And in fact, how we put an exhibition together more generally. I think worth saying, Deb and I work together at Museums Victoria, as Margie's mentioned, and we have quite different but complementary roles. I'm an exhibition producer. Oh, we've lost the slides, Deb. Great, thank you. So I'm the exhibition producer, and my job, not unlike a sort of a TV or a film producer, is to kind of run the whole exhibition as a kind of project, run its development. And that means bringing together all the different work streams, design, curation, the project budget, and then the production in terms of how we actually make and install the physical exhibition, as well as any media that we're putting in as well. So I have quite a sort of overarching role. And Deb is a curator, and she'll talk a little bit more to her particular role in projects around, which is more around sort of storytelling and collections and pulling together narratives. But I wanted to start with a question that perhaps you might all like to think about in your own heads. It's also the question that brought Deb and I together at Museums Victoria. It's one we've been asking recently in our own work. And the question is, how would you tell the story of Melbourne in an exhibition? And this is, as I said, a topic that Deb and I have been considering recently as we were asked at Museums Victoria to consider what a new contemporary version of that story at Melbourne Museum might look like. So we've done some work recently on that. But it's also probably the question that underpins some of the projects that Deb's going to show you tonight. So to answer this question, we might consider some other questions that perhaps unpack that a little bit more. Again, consider what might that story be if you were asked to tell the story of Melbourne in an exhibition? What might that story be? So things we've been thinking about, things you might also think about. What is Melbourne? Where is it? Is it just the city, or where do we draw the boundaries of Melbourne? Over the whole lifespan of the city, its boundaries have changed many times, and they continue to change. I think even recently this year, the boundary of Melbourne has increased again. So where do you kind of draw the line? What is and isn't Melbourne? Where does it start and stop? Also, who is Melbourne? Is it just the people who live here? Is it people who are kind of passing through? They might be here for days or years or months. Are they also part of Melbourne? Is it people who've been here a long time? People who've been here a short time? Is it people of all ages? So how do we kind of say whose story that really is? Also, how long is Melbourne's history? I think something we encountered very quickly was that I think most people would agree that Melbourne's history doesn't commence with its kind of colonial history. There's a much longer history there, and a continuous First Peoples history and cultural presence that kind of has been there a much longer time and continues to be there and will be there in the future. So there's that kind of length. And then also, is its story, is its history also its future and its present? Do we try and consider that as part of Melbourne's story? And if so, how do we tell that, which is, a big challenge. We also started to think, what makes Melbourne distinctive from any other city? Because I think when you're trying to create any kind of story about place, you're thinking, what makes Melbourne unlike, New York or London or any other city you might think about? What's its kind of essence? And what's Melbourne to a local, so to someone who lives here, which is very much their city, the city that they call home, and what's Melbourne to a visitor? And we found those things were kind of equally relevant in some ways. A visitor coming into Melbourne, they might want something that's kind of big and iconic and recognizable, like a kind of symbol system that they can understand Melbourne very quickly, like a shorthand. And locals, we started to find, they were much more interested in the side of Melbourne that wasn't maybe normally seen, kind of hidden Melbourne or sort of very personal Melbourne. So how do we balance those two things in our storytelling? The second question then, once we've thought about what is our story, the second question is, how would we tell that story? And again, if you maybe consider this question in your own minds for a moment, some things you might think about. Would you tell that story through Melbourne's laneways, for example? Would you try and take your visitors into Melbourne spaces, and maybe some of these, again, quite iconic spaces that you might think of as sort of traditionally or sort of classically Melburnian? Would you try and immerse visitors in those sorts of places? Or would you do something like an overview? So would you use things like data and population change? Would you give a sort of big picture way of understanding change over time and the way in which the city has evolved and populations have moved around? Or would you think about events as a way to tell Melbourne's story? Would you think about the kind of big things that have happened and the big kind of milestone moments that might have shaped Melbourne across time and might continue to do so into the future? Would that be one of the ways in which you'd tell that story? Or people? Would you say, okay, Melbourne's story is its people? And would you think about maybe Melbourne's most famous people, but also its everyday people? Would you be thinking, how can I go and find, very seemingly ordinary people who have, perhaps really amazing stories of how they've lived here and how their lives have been shaped in Melbourne. Or lastly, would you think about kind of material culture? Would you think I'll tell Melbourne's story through its objects? Its historical objects, maybe it's contemporary ones, artworks or things, or even everyday objects, things like collections from COVID and the pandemic collecting, for example, that talk to recent history. Would you think about futuristic material culture? What sorts of objects might imagine Melbourne's future, and all the kinds of opportunities that you might have with those? And I would guess at this point you're thinking, as an audience member, that you would be doing all of those things. Perhaps you'd be thinking about places, you'd be thinking about data and overviews, people, material culture, events, and you'd be mixing all those together. But then also when you're making an exhibition, if you do mix all that together, often it's a total mess. You get a complete cacophony of all of these things. So part of our work in exhibition making, and I think this is one of the themes that Deb's going to pick up on, is how do we organize that for a visitor? How are they going to walk into the exhibition and make any sense of what's going on in there? And so we end up talking about selection and curation. How do we shape all of these ways of telling stories into something that makes sense to a visitor? So that was a bit of a sort of way into some of these big questions. And now my job in this introduction is to set up some of the principles or sort of qualities of an exhibition. And then Deb is going to take you through a sequence of really interesting exhibition projects, real exhibition examples, as a way of, I think, unpicking some of these big ideas. So bear with me if these seem a little bit abstract, but I think hopefully you can see these as principles that will frame up a little bit what Deb's talking to. So exhibitions, I think what I was hoping to speak to here a little bit is how you can think of an exhibition as a kind of medium. And I mean a medium as in any of you might work with a medium. If you're a writer, your medium is kind of the written word. Your medium is essays and perhaps articles or stories or something, novels perhaps, or a documentary book. Or if you're perhaps a filmmaker, your medium is film or TV. If you're an artist, your medium might be sculptures. Everyone's kind of got a medium that they're working in. And for Deb and I, an exhibition is our medium. And like any medium, I think it has a few qualities that are perhaps different from other mediums. And so therefore, when we're thinking about how to tell that story, we're thinking about what are the possibilities or the kind of capacities of our medium that we need to kind of work with. So I think some of these for exhibitions that make it a little bit different to other kinds of media. Exhibitions are very located because they're usually, not always, there are online exhibitions, but often exhibitions are physical and they're located in a physical space, and they're also kind of framed up by that physical space, usually as a kind of institution. So what I mean by that is when you're going into an exhibition inside Melbourne Museum, you're kind of already going in through the frame of I'm going into Melbourne Museum, and you've already kind of got an idea of what that is, and you're within that the context of that site and that building. So they're kind of really located, and I would say that that does inflect the kind of meanings that visitors make out of them, because visitors are kind of coming in very much with that frame. Exhibitions are also multimodal, which means that they essentially just combine different media all working together to tell a story. So we've got, for example, an exhibition, you have objects, you have spatial design, you might have multimedia, things like video, soundscapes, we have lighting, we often have obviously text and graphics. So we've got all of those sort of that multimodality in an exhibition environment all working together to tell stories. Exhibitions are also usually social in that, again, visitors, and think about this in comparison to other media. So, someone reading an article, for example, that's usually quite a solitary activity. In exhibitions, usually the visitors encountering our medium are encountering it most often with other people. Sometimes not. Sometimes they're wandering around by themselves, but a lot of the time they're there with friends or family, and they're kind of discussing things or kind of going around together. And so they're experiencing and sort of meaning making kind of in dialogue with other people. And lastly, and this is sort of, again, a strange one to wrap your head around, but an exhibition is also usually experienced in motion because it's in space. Our visitors are walking through our story. So we have to kind of account for their physical movement and take that into our shaping so that we can use that to make meaning. So there's a kind of physical order in which visitors encounter things that becomes really important to our thinking. Some other qualities of the sort of exhibition medium that I think we tend to try and amplify or work with, they're very layered. again, because of that multimodality. You've got multiple types of media working together. You can kind of really layer up stories. You can have big stories, then you can have smaller stories that visitors can kind of go and find and delve into. Not everything has to kind of sit at the same level. They can be very immersive. This is an example of an exhibition called Charmer, a temporary exhibition that we had at Melbourne Museum at the end of last year and earlier this year, which was around First Peoples' ways of understanding the natural world. And that was a big, beautiful kind of immersive exhibition where you could go into the natural world and experience it in all these kind of amazing ways. Exhibitions can also be interactive. Again, unlike a lot of other mediums, there's really a chance for visitors to actually contribute to the story. They can contribute their own thoughts. They can kind of use digital interactives and pursue an aspect of the story that they're particularly interested in. So again, there's lots of kind of non-linear ways of sort of storytelling and meaning making there. And also lastly, exhibitions can be material. This is an example of some objects from our Bunjalaka gallery, our First Peoples gallery at Melbourne Museum. So exhibitions, I think, can really utilize the kind of qualities and the power of real material objects right in front of you, physical three-dimensional objects that are real and authentic and kind of hard to match anywhere else in them. So hopefully that gave you a sense of the medium, and then I'm just going to quickly indicate some of the considerations, again, at a sort of broad principle level before Deb jumps into some examples. So we're thinking about these big 4 frames when we're trying to kind of curate or organize our exhibition. Narrative, obviously, what is the story? So the kinds of questions that started to come out when we talked about the Melbourne example at the beginning. What's the big story that we're telling? Audience, who's it for? Who are we telling it to? Experience, how will we tell it? What are those sort of modes that we're choosing to tell that story? And then a lot of the sort of practicalities. So how will we actually make it? What's our space? What money do we have to do it? What program do we have? So all those sort of practical things as well. And then just unpacking a little bit of those. So narrative, we're thinking what's the story there? So what's the concept that underlies the exhibition? And is there an overarching story? What kinds of key themes and messages might be we trying to get across? And also, what do we have to tell the story? And that usually for us at museums includes our museum collections, our material culture. So we're often thinking, what do we actually have in our collection that will generate or spark stories? And for history exhibitions, which is our topic here, I think this is a great question. How do you make history into a story? And I imagine most of you in the audience have had to grapple with this in some form or other when you're trying to take like real history that really happened and somehow edit that down into a story that you can communicate in some form to someone else. Our audience, who is it for? So our visitors, we need to think about what they want, what do they expect, and importantly, what will be relevant to them. If it's not relevant to them, they tend to not really pay any attention, or, again, exhibitions are spatial. They can just leave. They can just walk out if it's not interesting. So we need to think about what's going to engage them. And also generally, how will they be included themselves? We've found most visitors like to see themselves in some ways reflected in the exhibition, or they want to kind of recognize an aspect of themselves in it, and often contribute to it as well. And for history exhibitions particularly, again, whose history is it? And who do we expect, and who do we kind of encourage and welcome to contribute to that story? Experience, how will we tell it? There's a range of different interpretive approaches we can use connected to those sort of qualities of exhibition mediums that I think Deb's going to give some more detail around. Design approaches, are we using video? Are we using sound? Are we creating sets? Do we have exhibition objects and showcases? And an important one, I think, for Deb and I in particular is this idea of leaving space for change. So leaving an exhibition opens on day 1, but then we're also thinking if it's going to last a long time, maybe 5 or 10 plus years for a permanent exhibition, how can we leave some space for something to be updated in that time? Again, especially with history exhibitions, what's kind of authentic? What feels real to visitors, and how can we give them something they feel is real? But also, if history changes or perspectives on history change over the time of the exhibition, how will we then go back and update that? And lastly, the pragmatics. This is sort of how we make it. What space do we have to do it? What's our budget to make it? We need usually a program. So we're usually on a sort of exhibition development program where we know we've got 1 or 2 or 3 years to make the exhibition. And then we also need to be drawing on research and resources. So, real people like subject matter experts, academics, consultants, people who might help us out with some expertise there as well. And this is also linked to this idea of history exhibitions needing to be updatable. If we've taken all this time and all these resources to make it, what do we then have to go on and update it in the future once it's open? So just putting back those 4 frames back up as a reminder, these are our kind of ways into creating an exhibition and helping us to think about how we're going to pull it together. I'm going to hand over now to Deb just to take you through some more specific examples that hopefully might unpack these in a bit more detail and take you through a good trajectory of how we've made some of these exhibitions in the past.
Excellent. Thanks very much, Tracy. This has got the makings of a masterclass, I have to say. There's just so much important information condensed there in that short and useful introduction. For me, it's always great looking at the pragmatics and ideas behind exhibitions and to reflect on changes and trends in our practice over a long period. And it's especially great today, I think, to be hearing that you're hearing from both a producer and a curator, Tracy and I, so you can sort of see the differences and overlaps in our methodology. We've had several goes at exhibiting the history of Melbourne at Melbourne Museum with varying degrees of success, and I'm going to introduce them to you now. Each of the following exhibitions had particular qualities that located them in time in terms of both scholarship and interpretative practice, which you'll see. So the first exhibition about Melbourne at Melbourne Museum opened in a space called the Australia Gallery in 2000. There it is. It contained 4 sections, mostly comprising objects, images, texts, angled poles and wedges of assorted design treatments, as you can see in this image. The key section was Stories from a City, which you're looking at there, which was, and I quote, an exploration of the history of Melbourne, its people, neighbourhoods, workplaces and cultures. And this included the businesses of Pruact and Glowweave and the pigment manufacturers of Australia, a manufacturing business. The next section, Windows on Victoria, highlighted key events reflecting Victoria's diverse history since European settlement, including the bicentenary, the Olympics and the 8-hour day. Far Lap, a true legend, was all about the drama of the reveal, but it placed the horse a distant last in exhibition layout behind a curtain at the back of the gallery. Visitors struggled to find, and I quote, Australia's first media superstar. The final section at digital.au was located on the other side of the building. It provided, and I quote, interpretation of the hype and jargon of the digital world in order to explain the basic principles behind the digital. It featured Australia's first computer, CIRAC, and other early electronic and digital technologies. In many ways, this suite of exhibitions was an artefact of its time. Freed of the structure of chronology, it ranged across themes and topics, providing vignettes of society and culture, many of them quirky, that visitors could explore at random. It was ambitious, with dense layers of ideas and motifs and imagery that frankly could overwhelm the senses, as perhaps you see here. The approach was very fragmented, and of course, one of the key challenges we face when developing history exhibitions is that they are and must be so encompassing of people's times and places. I'll just show you another view there of the exhibition. Strangely enough, the exhibition was almost devoid of images of people. In 2004, 4 years after it opened, audience evaluation highlighted these and other problems. Visitors, we found, disliked the lack of an overarching narrative in the space. They wanted, as they said, an overall history. Visitors noted that the themes were scattered, or felt the themes were scattered. They felt the choice of stories was trivial or not well presented, and key stories in Melbourne's history were omitted or understated. The layering and density of content was problematic, as was the use of symbolic elements that didn't work, a very loud cautionary message. Visitors found that they were not readable or too subtle. And for instance, the exhibition included a piazza, which was read as an empty space, not as a symbolic gathering space for Melburnians. And then there were colonnades, which were 5 poles with single objects on top, which included Kylie's wedding dress and the animals on decimal currency. They were sort of puzzlingly disconnected and not clever statements about sort of key icons of Melbourne or Melbourne architecture that they were intended to be. And the exhibition was based on a street grid, but ironically, the visitors couldn't read the grid, so they got lost. But there were elements that our visitors did like, particularly the more immersive and contextualised elements, such as a post-war school playground, which I'll show here, complete with shelter shed, lunch boxes and bubbler taps, and evocative playground photographs. The voices of children playing brought the space to life, and visitors could leave their own memories of play and games that would become part of the Australian Children's Folklore Collection. You'll see that this area was much more visually coherent and calm. Visitors also liked stories of Little Lon, how this 19th century inner Melbourne district was rediscovered and brought to life through archaeology and stories. So understanding that both the choice of content and interpretation in the existing exhibition were problematic, but that its immersive elements were successful, in 2005 we began work on a complete replacement for the Australia Gallery. I was co-lead curator with Lisa Dale, and every curator in the then Society and Technology department contributed significant content. It was very much a collective effort. So we based our approach on what the audience asked for. So the exhibition was led by chronology. It was to be underpinned by personal stories and include as many immersive moments as possible and as many of the key Melbourne events as possible. So we began our curatorial work by identifying the key events and stories in Melbourne's history with input from a broad range of audiences. And we started with a crude but effective methodology, which involved going to the butcher's shop in those days and getting these large pieces of paper. And we wrote essentially a decade for each of Melbourne's post-settlement history on each of the pieces of paper. And any passing colleagues or visitors could scribble ideas about what was important to them or what stories they wanted to see told. And in a parallel process, we analysed our society and technology collections to identify iconic content from Melbourne's history and to illustrate key stories and events. And at that stage, there were about 500,000 items in our collection, about half objects and the rest images and documents. And of course, the collection's grown since then. And a significant proportion of these collections had been donated and documented in close association with communities. So these links, this engagement with communities was a critical principle of the exhibition. And it was also an important principle to include a diversity of stories and experiences through time, including First People stories and content that sometimes challenged accepted understandings of Melbourne's past. So we were fortunate to have the resources to include a continuous process of internal and external visitor evaluation to test stories and images and approaches to interpretation. We especially wanted our exhibition to work for all of our audience motivational segments. So we then divided our audience into 4 types with the slightly strange but reasonably understandable titles of easy riders, duty-bound, informers and inspirers. Usually we focus on 1 or 2 of these segments, but this time we wanted an exhibition that would work with everyone or for everyone. We also had significant advice from our academic advisory committee, so people who'd spent long years researching and writing about Melbourne's story and engaging with our communities. So now I'm going to show you a little bit about sort of how we sort of structured the content. So the next slide I'll show you shows you how we structured our chronology. And the chronology, if you can think, is radiating outwards from the central Melbourne map experience. So each period marked in colour is about 2 decades of Melbourne's history. And this next slide shows you a little bit more of the detail that goes into planning the layout. And I don't expect you to read it. It's simply to show you how the layers of intense thinking and population of the space occur as we develop exhibitions. But in the next slide, which is much nicer to look at, this is the installed exhibition. So you can see in the middle slide, plinths, which were in the form of old mileposts, which mark out the 7 chronological periods of the exhibition. and each are printed with key events and a scene-setting narrative for that period. And you'll notice straight away how much less visual noise there is in comparison to the old Australia Gallery. So the Melbourne Story opened in 2008 to a very enthusiastic reception to all our audience types. And it was very generously reviewed by Grace Karskens and Graham Davison and others. And it's lasted very well with few updates apart from object changeovers, which is just as well because the Australia Gallery was open for 7 years, whereas the Melbourne Story has been open for 15 years and counting. And we're very enthusiastic about the notion of a replacement coming, as Tracy's been explaining. The immersive elements of the exhibition have been particularly successful. On this slide, you can see the walkthrough of the 1890s Coles Book Arcade, the 1920s cinema where you can watch newsreels and advertisements from the different periods, and a 1950s lounge room. And on the next slide, you can see the little lawn cottages, and again, on the left, a detail of the design, which is probably a little hard to read here. I'll just go one slide forward again. So the next slide, and you're probably mostly familiar with these, but it shows how far we extended the original approach to Little Lon from the Australia Gallery. So we now have here walk-through cottages, archaeological displays, and explanations of the science and the research that goes to reimagining and recreating these sorts of sites. And the public absolutely love it and understand what we're trying to do. So not surprisingly, the once effective interactive digital content that was installed with the Melbourne Story, which was essentially a central dynamic map experience and touchscreens, are looking dated now. So that's always the challenge with technology, and particularly it's going to be a challenge for our new Melbourne exhibition as our interpretation becomes more technology driven. So I have to say lower tech interactivity in the Melbourne Story has, as you'd imagine, endured better, such as photo albums and stereoscopic viewers, which draw on the original formats that Melburnians would have used or accessed. There are still some special challenges for the Melbourne Story, which provide us pointers for the next iteration. So navigation's still not obvious for some visitors. And as Tracy mentioned, updating an exhibition like this to include contemporary content, to reflect sort of changes in the last few years and decades is increasingly difficult. And fundamentally, I'd say exhibitions need to be both viewed and resourced by museums as live projects for the entire time they're on display, even if it's years and years. But especially this is the case for long-term exhibitions, because we've got to have regular object changeovers based on conservation advice. We've got to have routine and maintenance, and the world changes. We've got to reflect that if we're trying to tell the whole story. The opportunity to mount an exhibition in line with the centenary of World War I provided a chance to take new approaches to a history exhibition, and I began as lead curator on World War I Love and Sorrow 3 years after the Melbourne Story opened, and was joined by assistant curator Liz Bramley and consultant Marina Larson. And like the Melbourne Story, we received valuable guidance from an expert committee of Australian academics and content specialists, including Al Thompson. Thanks, Al. Love and Sorrow was a fundamentally different type of exhibition, but you can really see the DNA of the Melbourne Story in it. And first thing you see here from the layout of the exhibition is basically it's not entirely clear unless you're familiar with the exhibition. But in this case, the exhibition, let me just add the dates in. The exhibition runs in a chronological anti-clockwise path. That's got it. The exhibition in this case had a key unifying theme and was led by personal stories and had a clear path. So Melbourne Story, you could go in a number of different directions, understanding where you were in time, but here it is a single path. So you met the 8 key characters or persons involved in the war at the entrance, and you followed their stories as they unfolded through the war years right up to the present day, where descendants reflected on their enduring meaning and significance. So the progressive stories approach was supported by a phone app that provided deep content, including photographs and letters read by relatives. And working with families was a critical part of the exhibition's development and life. Our aim here was to tell an honest and graphic account of the war and its impacts through lifetimes and through generations. We included unsettling and upsetting sometimes photos and stories, and focused on building resonance and emotional engagement. We actually mapped the intended emotional experience of visitors as they moved through the path of the exhibition. And this is a real behind the scenes thing. This is the sort of not necessarily public part of how we think of an exhibition experience. So here we're thinking of taking visitors through an emotional journey, but also we're thinking of the emotional story of the exhibition. So the build up, the tension, the denouement, the emotional arc of the exhibition. And I'll just show you a couple of photographs of the exhibition to give you a sense of it. Here on the left is the home hearth, which included personal stories and visitors reading those stories in the separate cases. And the next story here on the left is the very poignant story of Frank and Ruby Robertson. Frank was killed in the last months of the war and never met their daughter, Nancy. And this photo was taken not long after they were married, I believe. The scene on the right recreated a corner of the battlefield using Museums Victoria objects. So, like the Melbourne story, the exhibition included immersive spaces, but we pushed the experience further, and most notably it was a space recreated a battlefield called Glencorse Wood in Belgium. So here visitors walked into a theatre projected with changing panoramic views of the same place over time. Amazingly, it had been rephotographed during the war. So the first scene was the early battlefield, and then the later photographs showed the devastated battlefield, including actually live fire, which is terrible to see, and right through to the forest that's there today. And we got that forest photographed for the exhibition. So visitors' shadows projected into the space, cutting through to the next layer of time. And the sounds of both the actual weapons used there and the birds in the forest there today provided a really strongly emotional context. And the space also included behind the visitors, as they looked at the projection, the names of all 1,661 men killed in that battle, in that exact location over a week, from all armies, including German armies, British armies, Australian armies, including 2 of the soldiers whose stories were told in the exhibition. So Love and Sorrow was tremendously well received, and it won the 2015 Museums Australia Magna Award for the best high budget temporary exhibition in Australia, and it received accolades from across the world and remains one of the most lauded exhibitions Museums Victoria has ever mounted. Importantly for today's conversation, it was also hugely popular with audiences. About 3/4 of visitors said it had given them new perspectives. 89% of visitors said it had helped them to learn new things, and 97% said it made them think of the impact of World War I on Australian society. And that's the sort of impact we want to have when we do exhibitions about history. Which brings me to today, 5 years after Love and Sorrow closed. We face significant new opportunities as well as challenges in mounting exhibitions. And I'll just touch on a few key ones from my own perspective before Tracy takes us through some of her recent projects in the UK and Ireland. The issue of authenticity lies at the heart of much of what we do. In the Melbourne story, we've recreated spaces and objects for pragmatic reasons. For instance, we recreated Robert Hoddle's notebook, which was too fragile to leave on display. And we've recreated a Little Lawn Cottages, which I show here again. So in mounting a new history exhibition, the question is, will the pragmatics of recreations hold sway over original content? And will our audiences understand what's real and what's not? And as I said, with Little Lawn, our evaluation seems to indicate that visitors do make sense of it. although they make sense of it in little Lon, the issue of disinformation and misinformation for museums, which are still trusted sources of knowledge, is always front of mind for us, and we will always work to make sure our messaging is clear. But to extend this point, what are the markers of authenticity that future visitors will look for? Our audiences are increasingly aware of our ability to generate content, new truths, some might say. Generative AI is one of the leading challenges of our time. Cloning generators for voices, creating imagined pasts with Photoshop, making movies using actors who look real but are entirely digital. We need to be authenticators, as Professor Doug Boyd said last week. He's from the Louis B. Nunn Centre for Oral History at the University of Kentucky Libraries and gave a terrific presentation about generative AI and its implication for oral history. So what does this mean for history exhibitions? A great deal, as it turns out. Virtual environments have come ahead in leaps and bounds even since Love and Sorrow. And as Tracy mentioned, Melbourne Museum has shown more of the potential of virtual environments last year in Charmer. And I'll just go back to another image of that, which used huge high resolution projections and digitally created content to create hyperreal imagined landscapes populated by known species that the visitors could interact with. The potential of virtual environments is vast. The way they can overwhelm the sense of self, the scale of ourselves, has huge potential to take us into different, more receptive mindsets, but also to places and experiences that never existed in the past. I should just note, of course, this particularly applies to exhibitions that are resourced to be able to do these extraordinarily expensive exercises. As museums, we also need to remember how much visitors want to see real objects, and our evaluation certainly tells us that. The future, no doubt, lies somewhere between the physical and the virtual, with virtual contexts highlighting the experience and the understanding of the physical. The content focus for history exhibitions too has to shift as we move through an age of crisis: climate change, floods, fires, plagues, droughts, the pandemic, and recent wars which impact everyone's communities in some way and are too critical to ignore. And I should say our industry has seen some important conceptual changes too. The International Council of Museums, ICOM, has a new definition of museums that's far more inclusive and community focused. And ICOM has a new strategic plan that places the United Nations 17 Sustainable Development Goals front and centre of our practice. And of course, the sustainability of our exhibitions is another technical, shall we say, issue that underpins everything we're now thinking. And also, it highlights the intellectual shifts in our profession that museums and history exhibitions have to embrace. And arguably the most important of these is decolonisation, obliging museums to right the wrongs of the colonial past and to reframe the past and present and the future in all of our work, including rethinking agency in exhibitions. And we're thinking more about identity and voice too, and new ways to embrace contradiction so that exhibitions provide alternative views side by side. And of course, this is tricky ground that adds another layer of complexity to the idea of museums as arbiters of truth, whatever that might be. I haven't got much more to say, but just a couple more comments. The other shift for us at Museums Victoria is towards an increasingly nuanced understanding of our audiences, which, as you can tell, has really underpinned what I've been saying. And this understanding, to some extent, aligns with new understandings of what museums are or can be. So I mentioned our previous 4 motivational segments. So we had the easy riders, the duty bound, the informers, and the inspirers. Well, now we have 6. So the inspirers are split, and they've split into connected, curious, and elite. So finding and sharing connections is a critical principle for today's history exhibition. So we get the connected bit. That's a welcome addition. The curious and elite segments are more challenging. Elite visitors, and I quote, can be single-minded and difficult to please and look for exclusivity and privilege. Curious visitors don't just want to find out, they need to gain a sense of intellectual superiority through this knowledge. I kid you not. This is problematic, obviously, arguably driven by the quick gratification of social media and the digital world. It presents real challenges for history exhibitions today and into the future. And no doubt related, we see a recent tendency towards self-focus for history exhibitions to be commemorations or commentaries rather about the world we live in today, not the worlds of yesterday. And of course, history always is more about those telling it than those experiencing it. But it's a mark of social maturity that we can acknowledge our own thinking or our own agency in both how we see the past and how we address its injustices. History also gives us insights and tools to live in today's world better, but sometimes we have to remind ourselves that the history is about what happened, not what is happening. And sometimes the more distant in time for us, the more engaging our exhibitions can be for our audiences. And just before I hand back to Tracy, I'd like to finish by briefly noting a couple of other recent approaches to history exhibitions that are taking some beyond the walls of traditional museums into communities where they can become vital cultural hubs. At a recent ICOM conference in Naples, Rachel Doucette from Haiti described a model in her country, which is still, as you could imagine, in the most dire of economic and political circumstances, and has experienced the impacts of colonialism and slavery for more than 3 centuries. But here in Haiti, in the remote mountains to the south, a small coffee history museum has been created by the community, which has become a vital hub for cultural life, revitalisation and memory, connecting young and old, generating economic activity and helping the community to regain a sense of dignity and pride. In telling their story, they are, as Rachel says, reappropriating their history. This deep relevance, connection and value is important, so important for history exhibitions. And finally, in Portugal, the Museum of Lisbon is modelling a decentralised history museum with many parts spread across the city. And the museum sites include a palace, a church, a plaza and a Roman theatre. Well, obviously we lack some of those sites, but the thinking underpinning it, that history is everywhere and that our communities are out there, not always internally inside the museum, but our communities are everywhere, provides some very important pointers for history exhibitions of the future. And now back to you, Tracy.
Thanks, Deb. And I think my close is actually really just a continuation of your last point there, Tim. So I'm going to end by just throwing up a few more examples that might even be provocations, I guess, as to how museums are doing things differently. As Deb was saying at the end there, I think there's a lot of changes right now in how museums are thinking about what they can do for their audiences, but also how they can tell history in different ways. And I think they're all sort of asking that question and answering it differently. So I'm just going to show at the end a few other projects that I think are offering maybe interesting answers to this question. So this one here is a project I worked on a few years ago for the Museum of London. They currently have a site at Barbican Wall in London. Some of you might be familiar with it. And they're in the process of moving to a whole new site, which is a kind of huge Victorian era market in West Smithfield. And, that since I was involved on that project, I think it's, moved on a lot. But I think one of the interesting things they were engaged with was this question that Deb and I have dealt with recently as well. How do you tell the history of a city and also its kind of present and its future? So they've got an amazing site now across 2 buildings with this kind of sort of central area that connects them, and then basements on both sides. So a huge amount of kind of area to tell stories. And I think the way that they were doing that is very interesting in terms of how they're looking at history. So they have a kind of narrative map across those 2 big buildings that you saw in cross section there, and that sort of middle connecting section, which is around different ways of understanding time. So on the right hand side there in the main market building, they've got our time. That's kind of coming in through the lens of the present. and then past time sitting underneath as you go down to the basement galleries, going back into the past. Real time in the middle, so they've got this area in the middle connecting, which is very much about like kind of time right in this very moment, not just the present, but kind of live data, live feeds, live visitor inputs right now. And then on the left hand side there, they've got a sort of temporary area. They've got deep time, which is their very kind of old storytelling that's very much about their collections. And then on the top level there, which I wanted to sort of draw to your attention, they've got a whole section called Imagined Time, which I think is a very interesting way to think about time. You know, is imagined history, is that just as relevant or interesting as real history, or what we think of as real history? And so they've got different sort of, I guess, fictional versions of London's history there, novels, films, paintings, designs, so different ways in which people have imagined the history of London. Another example there from the Design Museum, I think they're quite interested in sort of revisionist histories, as Deb was highlighting. I think there's a real interest now in museums in kind of offering different perspectives than have been traditionally given on the past, and in some ways trying to maybe correct some of the ways in which we've overemphasized certain people or certain groups or certain narratives of history more broadly. These are two of the Design Museum's recent exhibitions from the last few years. There's one there about the French designer Charlotte Perriand, who was actually a contemporary of the very famous French architect Le Corbusier. But I think many more people are familiar with Le Corbusier and very many less with Charlotte Perriand, even though she was his kind of equal as a designer. So the Design Museum there, by sort of mounting that exhibition, is trying to say she should have the same presence, or should we consider her in the same way as we do Le Corbusier, who's almost a household name. The exhibition on the right there from the Design Museum, that's one that we did last year around the British Nigerian designer Yinka Ilori. And he's a designer he's a contemporary designer. He designs a lot of furniture, but he really engages with the colonial history of Britain and of his home country, which is Nigeria. So a lot of his work and the patterns that he uses and the ways that he thinks about kind of color and texture and storytelling relate to his Nigerian heritage. But also I think some of the kind of colonial histories there, for example, around the image you can see there is showing the sort of famous Dutch wax textiles that are very common in Nigeria and influence a lot of Yinka Ilori's pattern making, but also have this really strong and interesting relationship to the narrative of colonial history in Nigeria. These images here are from the National Museum of Northern Ireland. They run several museums. This one is from the Ulster Museum and in Belfast. And this is not actually a project I worked on, but a project that I visited while I was working with them on something else. And I was really impressed and interested by the approach they'd taken to telling the history of the Irish Troubles. Obviously an incredibly challenging subject and a very difficult history. And they were telling it in this kind of way in which that history is still very raw. I think if you've been to Northern Ireland, you know that history is very raw there. It's really in lived memory. The people there, you know, that might be their family members who are directly involved. So it's a very difficult and emotionally kind of complex history. And obviously one where they were trying to give in this exhibition very equal weighting to different perspectives there on politics and on identity and history. And I think they did an amazing job in that exhibition in trying to say, how do we tell a really multi-perspectival history in a very fair way? And lastly, just wrong caption, a couple of examples that might be, I guess, provocations to what you might consider history. I hope you're kind of wondering if this is history or not, because I think that's a good question to ask. This is the wrong caption here, but this is actually the Lavazza Museum in Turin in Italy, a project I worked on a few years ago. And this museum is about Lavazza coffee, which hopefully many of you are familiar with. And they made a whole museum about the kind of heritage of their brand and their kind of company and their coffee making history, which dates back to the 1800s. But what I think is interesting about this museum is that it is a museum about coffee history, yes, but it's also really a museum about Italian history. And I think a lot of the things that feature in this museum are things like kind of old Italian technologies and advertisements from the 50s or 60s. And I think from a lot of Italians going through this museum, this is their very everyday history, their identity, the ads they saw as a kid, might be some of the coffee machines they recognize, you know, from the 80s that they used to use. So this is a very sort of personal history for a lot of people in this very kind of everyday way. even though it's within the frame of what you think of as a kind of brand museum. The last example I have here is Battersea Power Station, which is a huge power station in London that ran from the 1930s to the 1980s as a power station. I think many of you might recognize it from the Pink Floyd album cover with the floating pig. It's very iconic for being on the album cover. But it's also kind of an amazing heritage site that since it was decommissioned as a power station in the 80s, it's gone through a number of redevelopments. And the section that I'm showing you here is an exhibition within the historic turbine hall of the power station. And it shows you the history of this building in generating power for London. And that's the section you can see on the left there. And there's some original objects from the control room, some original kind of fittings from the power station. So you get this kind of very material culture perspective on its history. There's a kind of interactive table you can see there where you as a visitor can pretend you're like running the power station and how can you generate power for London. So this is kind of very interactive history. And then you go through a door and you hop in a lift, a glass lift, and you go up one of the chimneys in the power station. You can see some images on the right-hand side there of what it's like to be inside the chimney. You go up to the top and then you pop out on top. You've got a view over London. And I think interesting to consider whether this is history. Like on the left, probably yes. On the right, it's kind of a version of history that's very experiential and where you're almost sort of disappearing into the building yourself and becoming part of it and kind of traveling up this chimney in this quite fantastical way. And I think it's been very engaging for visitors as a way to, a very unconventional way to be telling what's essentially a heritage story. That's my close. I think that's my last example. I hope that's been an interesting journey for you all through a little bit of what Deb and I can share about how we make exhibitions. And I think I'll hand now to Alicia for some questions and answers.
Thank you, Deb and Tracy. What a whirlwind deep dive into some wonderful exhibitions that I'm sure many of our audience have seen over the years. That certainly took me back. And thank you both for being so generous with us, outlining such a structure, sharing with us your challenges and your achievements, and then that look to where we might go next. I'm going to invite our audience to drop any questions that you have in the Q&A box in the bottom menu bar. I know there's lots of you there, so I'm sure we'll have plenty of questions to keep us going. But actually, we've got a question already there from Jacqueline, and it's for you, Deb. Jacqueline says, I'm curious about Deb's point about museums and disinformation and misinformation. And I wonder whether you can share an instance of when an aspect of your exhibition perhaps contained disinformation or was misinterpreted by an audience, and what did you do in response?
That's a great question. Look, I'd probably look back to the Melbourne story in the sense of where and I did allude to this, the Robert Hoddle notebooks. So we had hoped to borrow the originals, sketches from the State Library and the notebooks. He's drawing out the first plans of Melbourne. So they're extraordinarily important and iconic for the foundations of the Melbourne settlement. But we weren't able to borrow them for a length of time that suited the fragility of or responded to the fragility of the object. So we have wonderful preparators in-house, and we said, look, can you have a look at the original, look at the photos of the original as well, and do your best to create a copy of it. And it was such a darn good copy. It was only when you actually turned the page and saw that there was nothing in the next page that you realized that this was a reproduction. So we were thrilled to bits. In it went, and it does say on the label, this is a reproduction. But, we've got to be so careful to make sure that visitors are understanding, in these cases where we're saying this is standing in for a real object. And I think when we have longer exhibitions that are on for so long, or perhaps the lighting conditions aren't right, then we've got to be pragmatic about showing reproductions or making reproductions. But but it's problematic as well. So I think there's something underpinning it about the visitor's expectation of something being authentic. If it looks like an object, surely it is the real thing. Why, you're a museum, why wouldn't you? Not that you made something so good that it could trick me into thinking that was what it was. And then why did we do it?
So do you lean towards being as explicit as you can around those sorts of reproductions, etc.?
Yes, and we like to have that in the title of the object, not as a sort of in brackets right down at the end in the small writing. It needs to be right up there, comma, facsimile, so there can be no doubt. But still, you know, none of us read every object label, and if we sweep quickly into an exhibition and, oh gee, there's that notebook and there's a story about Robert Hoddle, and wow. So I, you know, I do still have some lingering worry about how visitors read that. I think something like Little Long Cottages, we've done a lot of evaluation because we were quite anxious about it. But I think the fact that it's cottages inside a modern building, the Melbourne exhibition, and the cottages are sort of a cut by the wall of the modern building. I think there's no question that you're not walking into a real cottage. Now, if we'd gone down into the Little Long district and recreated a cottage, then I think then you're laying the ground for, you know, a possible sort of misunderstanding of the authenticity.
Yes. What about you, Tracy? Have you had that experience with that idea of, you know, whether it's a facsimile that people have misinterpreted or another piece of information?
Yeah, I think similarly to Deb, Alicia, we've always been really honest about where you're displaying a facsimile or a replica, and I think I've found we have the most difficulty when it's a very personal or kind of small scale object. People seem to really, you know, expect even more that that's authentic. Something that, you know, like if it's a replica of, for example, we used a replica of a child's toy in a previous exhibition. And again, even though that very clearly said replica, people just couldn't accept that it was a replica because it was so small and personal, and, you know, they connected in this very emotional way to it. And it was kind of a problem for them almost when they then found out that it wasn't real. They felt slightly betrayed by that. So I think, you know, just understanding where people are happy to accept that something's a reproduction and where we're sort of almost you know, trading on their emotional connection to it.
And look, you've tapped into that conversation around emotional connections, and of course, Deb, you've taken us through Love and Sorrow, and people have even commented in the chat here around how poignant and powerful that exhibition was. There are a couple of questions that I'm going to bring together for you. One is, could you comment on the importance of emotional engagement with the audience, even if it might be difficult or unsettling? And then on the other side, what is the responsibility of the curators and designers to create perhaps a space within the exhibition where people might be able to take time out if they need to gather themselves? So that first one, what's important and how do we look after people?
Yes, they're both excellent questions and really important. Yes, it is incredibly important to engage people's emotions, and it doesn't need to be the sad emotions, but the thing about Love and Sorrow is that we overcame resistance to going to the sad places as well as going to the happy places. Unfortunately, there is an expectation for particularly large museums that people have a good time there and go away feeling good. And actually for Love and Sorrow, we have visitor comments cards, which were almost universally congratulatory, except for one parent who said, oh, you know, this is not good at all. I just felt really sad and it upset my sons. And I sort of took it as a compliment because, you know, you're going to an exhibition about war and millions of people dying. And if you walk out not feeling upset and sorry and sorrow, there's something which is very wrong with the exhibition and with everything that we do. For Love and Sorrow, because we were so consciously taking people into really, really difficult and harrowing and upsetting content, we did have, sort of what we called a recovery space afterwards at the end of the exhibition. So we had a couch space where people could just sit quietly. That wasn't a through fare. And people could then write notes and just pause and reflect. So that became a really important part of the experience as well. Yeah. So, but yes, I think for certainly for Museums Victoria, it really brought home how important the emotional arc of an exhibition experience is, whatever those emotions might be that we want to evoke. And of course, no two visitors will respond in the same way to the content. But that's something we really need to consider. And we also need to consider similarly, the mental, support the mental health and mental experience of visitors. And I should also say that we did have brochures from veteran support networks also for the first year or two of Love and Sorrow as well, to just, acknowledge and provide those extra supports.
Yeah. And what about you, Tracy?
Yeah, I think I'm answering both parts of your question at once, Alicia, which is really, I think our practice around this and exhibition development has really changed a lot in the last 10 years. I think 10 years ago, we were doing a more simplistic, when we were developing an exhibition, we were doing a more simplistic kind of process of trying to map what emotions we thought visitors might have in different areas of the exhibition. Like, oh, this is the kind of, exuberant area, and this is the kind of sad area, and this is the, whatever. We were doing more of that. And then I think we found more an evaluation that didn't really work, because we can't predict actually what visitors will feel in any of those spaces. And a lot depends on, how they come in, who they come in with, what mood they're in that day, all these other things that, we couldn't really actually have any say over. So I think we've moved more towards a model of sort of emotional intensity mapping across exhibitions. And this is why I'm answering both parts of your questions at once, because I think what we try to do more consciously now is just kind of map the density of emotional content in each area, and in that way we can have these areas that are very kind of rich in emotional content, whatever emotions those might generate, positive, negative, everything in between. And then we have these areas that are kind of a little bit more relaxing, or a little bit like less taxing on you in that way, because I think we also found visitors got very tired. I'd say that was a big outcome of my evaluations, Deb, and probably yours as well.
Yes,
an
absolutely.
emotionally intense exhibition can be very fatiguing. So I think just making sure we pace that, I'd say that's a more contemporary way in which we're working.
And what are the sort of structures, you talked about the pragmatics, what are the sort of structures, Tracy, that you would respond to in terms of designing that exhibition if you were looking at emotional intensity?
Oh, I see. So I think we would, that's a good question. I think we would normally start in sort of Deb's area with the story mapping, because we always tend to start with sort of content and story first. So we'd be kind of arranging those stories, mapping and clustering them by different kind of emotional intensities, and the sorts of, as well as the thematic groupings, what sorts of emotions those might evoke. And then when we move into the design stages, we tend to actually then block that out on a plan drawing of the space. So we're kind of starting to go with the design team, all these stories are grouping together here in this area because it makes narrative sense, but also we can tell that's going to be a moment of emotional, intensity. And then, the designers tend to say, as we do that mapping, they tend to start saying these areas are really close together and they're both really emotionally intensive. Is that what we want? We're going to have a huge kind of crescendo there. Is that right? Or do actually we need to modulate that and maybe move this cluster over here? And then, so we sort of, it's very dynamic, that process of mapping stories into space. And we do, a few months of work on that, usually pushing and pulling that around. We tend to also audience test it a bit too. So we have different ways of kind of running focus groups, for example, with different groups of visitors. And we show them different proposals. We ask them to imagine different scenarios, and we often get their feedback too, to help us make sure we get that right.
And we've got a question here for you, Tracy, from Alison, who says, following on from that emotional conversation, Alison says that you mentioned the raw nature of the Ulster exhibition on the Troubles, and given perhaps a reluctance of museums to dwell on the sad in some cases, how hard is it to dwell on the political?
Yeah, that's a great question. But I can't unfortunately answer that for the Ulster Museum one, because as I said, that was a project that I wasn't involved in. I was doing a different project with them. But I think it's interesting here in Australia. You know, and I'm relatively new to Australia, and I think I'm learning a lot from a truth telling from First Peoples, and the idea of truth telling, and how you can acknowledge sad and difficult stories, but also, you know, really politically challenging stories, in a way where you acknowledge them and you kind of recognize them, but you also move through them, and you can allow them, if that's making sense. I'm learning a lot from that approach. That's been really great for me here. I think generally with really politically controversial exhibitions I've done, I think we've found that visitors, for the most part, just appreciate honesty. They would much rather that you said, and I think this is especially true around whose perspective it is. They would appreciate generally if you bring in multiple perspectives and you're very honest about whose perspective it is, and then they're more willing to accept things that might be different to their own views or that might contradict what they feel. They're much more willing to say, okay, that's someone else's perspective, and not mine. I don't know if I've answered your question, Alicia, though. Have I? Deb might want to add something there, Deb, in terms of the exhibitions you've done.
Well, the only thing I was thinking about is we also need to be pragmatic about who's paying the bills, and of course we are always loyal to our organisations, but one thing we do realise and acknowledge is that when you are a government-funded organisation, there can be challenges, and we need to be sensitive to the context by which we're resourced. You know, generally speaking, Museums Victoria does have a free hand, but it's just something else to acknowledge in the political sphere that we are a politically funded organisation.
And absolutely. And in fact, maybe that's a way to answer the question in a better way, is I think what we found visitors tend to hate is when we try and have a museum voice that is, you know, pretending to be apolitical when it's not. You know, that's what they tend to find really sort of objectionable. And we're on safer ground if we show a variety of perspectives and we're honest about where those come from.
That's right, exactly. And these days we're much less inclined to try and have a museum voice, as you say, to, you know, to acknowledge the authorship, even, you know, who curated the exhibition or who wrote particular labels and that sort of thing, to sort of acknowledge your voice or the community's voice. I mean, just at the very most basic level, for so long now, we've been incorporating the voice of community in what we exhibit.
And I'm sure lots of our audience as well, I know, might be from much sort of smaller organisations or doing things on a smaller scale. So we might get to that in a minute, but there's a good question from Christine that follows on from that notion of how do museums dwell on the political or not, with a specific question about if there's an exhibition reimagining Melbourne, would we include, or would you include, something of the huge importance of the CBD as a centre of protest and democratic expression over many decades? You know, thinking of all of those venues for gathering, whether it's Parliament House or State Library, Fed Square, etc. Perhaps that gives us a more tangible sort of idea of how might we engage with the political on that front.
What a great question. And Tracy, you included a protest picture in your, I think it was a Union March maybe, in your presentation. Maybe I'll speak to that, and then you might like to as well. Yes, actually, we have a rapidly developing politics and public protest collection at Museums Victoria, and that will be an incredibly important inclusion in any future exhibition that tries to encompass the history of Melbourne. It's community voice on the street is one of the most critical underpinnings after politics itself. Yes, we certainly will. Tracy, would you like to?
Oh, can't add much, Deb, other than that's literally one of the sections that we mapped out for a new version of a Melbourne story. So whichever visitor asked that, you're well on top of it. That's what we were thinking to do. And look, I think that's those are really dynamic stories of protest. You know, they're generally hugely energetic and really interesting. And I think the sites of protest too, which is also coming through in your movement, you know, that where those protests happen, the locations of those in the city and that kind of physical context to them too. It's also something that, you know, Deb and I and the team were thinking of bringing into the exhibition too.
There you
Yes, well,
go.
I mean, that's a nice reference back to the sort of the experiential part of exhibitions and exhibition development. How is it that rather than just sort of static pictures of protest, can you feel the energy? Can you feel like you're there in the streets? Can you feel your way back into an 1890s march or a 1980s march? How can we take you there in any sort of visceral way? It's a fun challenge, but yeah, we've got some thoughts.
That's great. I'm looking forward to seeing what we see next, and loving our audience's contributions tonight. We've got a question in here about emotional intensity, or following on from that conversation, and tiredness. And Nina asks, is it important to factor in sensory diversity as well, especially with increasingly digital exhibitions? How do you balance that?
Shall I answer that first, Deb, and see if
Yes.
you have anything? Yeah, okay. Yeah, that's a great point, and also definitely a related kind of area of development that we tend to do alongside. I think, a huge trajectory in exhibitions over the last, I'd say, 25 years has been that they become increasingly multi-sensory. They used to be very much the older model of showcase with things in it and some text, and they were very visual, not much else. And I think we've seen a huge kind of progression in the different sort of sensory tools that we've got in our toolkit, which include things like media, but also audio, soundscapes, tactile, interactive, so physical things you can touch that have textures and feel really interesting. And even, smell is, I would say, still an emerging area. It's always kind of a great idea, but it's hard to do well, and it can go very wrong. So we haven't done that too much, but we have done it a few times. Just that can be a very interesting sense to draw on. And I think to answer the other part of your question, that what we tend to do with that sort of sensory information in exhibition is also map that in a similar way to we map emotional intensity. We tend to also map out sensory intensity. We found with, for example, neurodivergent visitors, or visitors who have different kind of needs and preferences, sometimes they hit sensory overload very quickly, and that makes that exhibition not really very inclusive or accessible to a large section of the population. So we tend to do that mapping very carefully. We often get some kind of specialist advice to help us do that, and it's really about making sure that we have a good pacing of those sensory experiences across the exhibition, and that we're offering all of those, because sometimes visitors will come in with, for example, who are hearing impaired or who are sight impaired, and that way those other sensory ways in offer a lot to them. But putting all those in the same space at the same time, you tend to hit overload for those visitors for whom that's a problem. So it's quite a delicate process of then just mapping out where all of those different senses are being engaged, and where they're starting to come together in the same kind of areas, if that makes sense. Deb, did you want to add anything to that in terms of?
No, I think that was a point well made. I was just going to add a similar sort of point about neurodiverse visitors for whom we're increasingly aware, and we've been working for a few years on a project at Museums Victoria to focus on sort of audiences who are on the spectrum and how we might provide particular guides or particular experiences, maybe at museum after hours or support, so that we can sort of reduce that sort of, I guess, the background noise, for want of a better word, that museums, the exhibitions can bring. And that really takes me back to the Melbourne story and the visual noise of that, which was, as I said, of its time, to be fair. But these days, thinking about how neurologically diverse people may be reacting to that level of input, we just need to be much more sensitive of it now, which I think makes for better exhibitions for all audiences, to be honest.
Absolutely. And I think you've tapped into, there was a question earlier on from Brett, who was asking that, what do we need to be mindful of as we move more into those experiential immersion type exhibitions? So is there anything else? Because you've covered so much there in terms of what we need to think about.
It did remind me of an exhibition we did 4 or 5 years ago that included flashing lights. And I think once again these days we'd probably be much more cautious about that sort of thing. So the walk-in immersive experiences, you probably wouldn't have the pulsing flashing lights that could set some of our audiences off. So, and certainly we have the warning signs, but would we even do that at all? now. So I think there are a range of areas that we're much better at. You know, it was only 2 or 3 decades ago that we didn't make sure that space was big enough for standard wheelchairs, for instance.
Yeah.
And that we had sharp corners and tripping hazards that could trap or sort of be a problem for visually impaired people. So I think all of the past few decades, we're progressively improving our practice. And as Tracy said, we have more and more tools in our kit, both to use, but to help us understand how we do better exhibitions.
Yep. I've got a question here from Ella, who says, how do you incorporate underrepresented voices into exhibitions before they go public? For example, engaging with young people.
I'll make a start of that maybe, and then Tracy. Look, one of the first thing to do is to establish the principles for the exhibition you're developing, and to say at the outset, this exhibition is going to have as many diverse voices as possible. The next thing is, how do we work with the communities that we work with and reach into new communities to ensure that the exhibition includes their voices and also includes the voices of people they would like to hear.
You're muted now, Deb. I think you've suddenly muted.
I touched something. It's a real thank you. It's a real process of opening our doors, and I have to say that as the years have passed, we have built such rich collections donated at Museums Victoria, donated by our community, that there are so many stories ready to go, and being open to more stories and more perspectives is just a critical underpinning of what we do.
And Tracy?
Tracy, yes.
Yeah, no, I'd completely agree. And I think the thing I've seen really is that we've really broadened out what we mean by voice in this context too. Because I think, again, you know, maybe 15 years ago, we used to do more of the, like, a voice is like a voice in the exhibition, like it's a text panel with quote marks and it says, you know, this person says this. And we do still do that for sure. It's a great tool. But I think we've also increasingly kind of understood that voice can be reflected in different ways in the exhibition. I think our exhibition development process, for example, is a lot more kind of engaged and collaborative than it used to be. And it's something actually we haven't really touched on, Deb, but we were already starting to do this with the question Deborah and I have been considering recently, which is what would a new Melbourne exhibition look like? Also with another exhibition that I'm currently developing for the museum, we go out a lot more during our early development phases to various groups and actually just ask them about themes they're interested in, stories, what would they like to see in the exhibition. So I think that voice comes in loads earlier too, in terms of actually shaping out what's in them. For example, we've just done some great workshops with some young people through schools visits where we asked them what they want the future to be like, because we're thinking about that for another exhibition. And that was really fun. They did loads of cool drawings for us and loads of answers. So I think, you know, those voices are coming in even at the kind of shaping stage. And then sometimes those voices that get reflected in other ways in the actual exhibition. We commission a lot more than we used to. We commission artists or designers, or sometimes we kind of go and, you know, just get everyday people to contribute their object, and sometimes the story behind it, but sometimes it's just that they're represented there by their object too. So I think there's been a real sort of broadening of the ways in which we, you know, it's not just us kind of making the exhibition, but actually lots of people and lots of different communities contribute.
Well, absolutely. In fact, Al's made the important point that the Immigration Museum and many museums do have community galleries where the space is for the community to do with as they will with this, whatever support they need from the museum. At the moment, the Immigration Museum doesn't have a specific community gallery, but it's an incredibly important model as an opportunity to for communities to do their own exhibitions, because it's critical to what we do.
Yeah. And I think one of the wonderful things we've heard tonight, and obviously we acknowledge the bigger resources that Melbourne Museum has compared to, say, some of these other little smaller places or commissioned work that we might do. But your understanding of your audience, your seeking out of audience feedback, you know, really comes through in the presentation that you've both given tonight. I'm going to give you one last question before I hand back to Margie. And it comes from Francesca, who asks, do you think that visitors come away feeling more positive about history? That is, do they better understand that there is not one version of the past, which can be perhaps used in political ways in the present?
I'll say, gee, I hope so. That's a wonderful comment on which to finish, because it's such an important thing for us, and for our audiences to feel the history is in a good place, and what's more, to enthuse and excite people about the past as well as the world we live in today. That's extraordinarily important. If we manage to do that, I think we've succeeded.
Any last words, Tracy?
Yeah, I'd agree. It's a great question, isn't it? And again, I hope visitors do come out feeling like that. And I think in some ways it loops back to the some of the qualities I was describing at the very start about what's unique to exhibitions as a medium. Because they're multimodal, they really do have that capacity for layering and like many different stories in the same space being delivered through different means. And I think, we're really missing a trick in some ways if we've done all that and we've only managed to get one perspective on history across. We've really, messed it up, I would say. So I think exhibitions for me have this really exciting capacity to hold so many different perspectives on the same topic and make you come away hopefully thinking, yeah, history isn't just one thing. There's not one version of it. There's so many different ways of telling the same story. I think that would be a great outcome for us.
Wonderful. Thank you both so much, and to all our audience for asking all those questions. And I'm going to hand over to Margie now.
Many thanks, Alicia. And thanks also for those two wonderful speakers, Deb and Tracy. Let me make sure I've got this PowerPoint actually where it needs to be. There we go. I thought that was just a fascinating discussion. Thank you so much, because you ranged over so many areas, not only discussing what you're doing, but talking about the complexity of planning and all of the different issues that are involved in thinking about exhibitions now. And it was just a wonderfully honest and wide-ranging discussion. So thank you so much. Thank you too to our colleague, Rowan Howard, who managed the webinar so seamlessly behind the scenes, and I'm hoping that he'll turn his video on so that you can see. There he is. So now you know who he is, and you know that he will be behind the scenes from now on. Special thanks also to our sponsor, Monash University Publishing, which provides a wonderful gift to each of our speakers. And a brief plug for our next seminar, which will be held at the same time in March, on the 21st of March, on the topic Australia's housing crisis. I hope you can join us for that, but also a special thanks for being part of our audience in 2023, and an opportunity, of course, to contribute towards the program in 2024. So Alicia has created again a Making Public History's feedback form, and it would be terrific if you would have a look at that and just give us your comments on the program over the year, tonight, obviously, but also a little bit further back if you can remember. Now, there's just one more announcement tonight, and this is a little bit sad, and I'm hoping that Al Thompson is still with us and will turn on his video too, because tonight we bid farewell to two of our long-term presenters of Making Public History. Both Al Thompson and Alicia Cerrito are familiar faces to everyone, but sadly both are moving on at the same time, which is not the brilliant timing, you two. Al has presented Making Public History pretty well continuously since 2008, which is extraordinary. He began the program collaborating with the History Council and the State Library Victoria, and has been involved ever since, with a brief period of rest, I think, at one point. Al, it's been just a wonderfully successful initiative, and we owe a huge debt of gratitude for all those years of really stimulating discussions. So many thanks from all of us, absolutely, and all the very best. And Alicia has been one of the main faces of Making Public History since she joined the History Council in May 2020. Her skill in managing the Q&A sessions is unsurpassed. I think everyone will agree. I don't know how we're going to manage without the two of you, but thank you for all your dedication, and we do hope that we'll see you involved in the future at some point. And finally, thank you so much to you, our audience, for your attendance and participation tonight. Thank you for all those great questions. The recording of tonight's event will be available in a few days' time on the History Council's YouTube site. But for now, good night, everyone.